Hi there, everyone. Welcome to our first event on forecasting UAE GDP. My name is PJ, and I'm joined by my colleague Rodrigo. And today we have a 30-minute session approximately where we would like to share some of our work on this topic. We would like to share what we've done exactly, what variables we've used, what models we've used, what results we're getting at the moment. We would like to share some of our insights on our motivation and techniques for forecasting UAE GDP. And this is the first of, we hope, 3 or 4 events during September. And we do hope to continue in future months and quarters similar events and show you our results as we go, show you our forecasts as we go, and reflect on each forecast from time to time in terms of how we're doing in terms of the forecasting UAE GDP and comparing with some other stakeholders in the market as well, like the IMF, who also forecast this variable, and the UAE Central Bank as well. So a little bit about MCC Economics. We're a small consulting firm, a boutique firm, and we have an office in Abu Dhabi. We started in London almost 10 years ago, and UAE GDP is one of the services that we offer alongside other economics and finance advisory services. So thanks for joining us today. So I'll just hand over to Rodrigo to take us through the first slide. Thanks, Rodrigo.
Hello everyone. Thank you for being here. All this started with our goal of finding a good model to forecast UAE GDP. We collected over 500 variables and trying to determine which ones impacted GDP or at least impacted a specific GDP sector so that we could aggregate the data later on. It was a very, very big effort. If you're familiar with the academic literature, we have many different ways to estimate GDP and to forecast pretty much each entity that we see out there. As PJ mentioned, this UAE Central Bank, the IMF, the World Bank, each one has their own models, has their own ways of estimating. If you look at academic work, there is a constant flow of new articles being published with new ways to estimate, and especially nowadays with the huge access to data that we have, big data. Everything nowadays has some sort of measurements attached to it. It becomes even more, let's say, in a way, becomes an even more challenging task to find a good model because you just have so many options. There's always the possibility of a better model that we can do. That's better than we have tried previously.
Yeah, and Rodrigo, we mentioned 500 variables, more than 500 variables, but could you tell us the time period, how much data we collected over which did we go back 5 years, or on which frequency of data we also collected as well?
Mm-hmm. So we've collected annual data, quarterly data, and monthly data. So of course we have different. We had to do different aggregation methods so that we could, for example, use the monthly data on our annual models or on our quarterly models. We have also collected data from 1975 up to 2022. Now, of course, in the ideal world, we would have all the observations for all the variables for all this period, but that's not how it works in the real world. So for some data points, we only have information after the 2000s. For some data points, we only have information up to, let's say, 2019 or to 2020. So we also had to work around a little bit on that. Of course, we also have many tools to deal with missing data at our disposal. So we made use of those tools in order to find, in order to have the best data possible for us to estimate our models. So yeah, that was a very, very broad range of both time frame and frequency of data that we collected.
Yeah, and sometimes it's hard to move between monthly and annual, or even daily and annual, but it's something that we tested out in our different versions.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, very good, very good. And then on slide 3, then what we show is just some of the categories of those variables, roughly 22 groups of different variables and data. Rodrigo mentioned the academic literature, which talks about which variables can forecast GDP, and those are the ones that we focused on, the ones that had the best success elsewhere, other countries, um, other forecasters, other government departments, other researchers. What do they use? And that's the variables that we want to define for the UAE and for Abu Dhabi. And so you can see here the different types of variables, and hopefully, if you know a little bit about GDP, you might get a sense of why these are important for forecasting, and why these would drive GDP. For example, higher interest rates are normally associated with lower GDP, and vice versa.
Mhm. Yeah. So as PJ was saying, we have many different relationships that we can find between all this data and GDP. In some of the categories that we've classified the data on, of course, we have some expectations in terms of how we believe they will affect GDP. So, as he mentioned, interest rates tend to correlate negatively with GDP. On the other hand, investments, being a component of GDP, tends to correlate with a higher GDP. Um, as well as having a lagged effect on the economy, meaning an increase in investment today tends to have a positive impact on GDP tomorrow. So we're also on the lookout for those types of relationships, and also, of course, correlations that might be, even though there's not a direct impact of one variable to GDP, it may have a good correlation, which we also did not exclude from our samples. So, for example, hospitality, one of the assumptions that we've seen in the literature is that, or with some evidence to back it up, and naturally, was that in periods of better economic activity, or the expectation of a better economic activity, you tend to see an increase in hospitality, in people traveling, because of course traveling is not a necessary consumption. It's not a necessary service. So whenever we see an increase in hospitality activity, it tends to correlate with a higher GDP. But if we look at, it's not that the high hospitality is causing the higher GDP; it's more the other way around. Yet, it's still something that is worth exploring when we're looking at specifically at the forecasting um, parts of our effort.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep,
And
very good.
so, PJ, so
Mhm.
what would you say was the biggest challenge in terms of collecting all of this data and classifying it? Was there anything that was easier to find or more difficult to find?
Yeah, the most difficult to find was the investment variable, actually.
Hmm.
Um, and we're still adding to some of these sources, and we're still adding to some of these categories, and we're still looking for better sources of some of these variables, which were quite late. Some of them were readily available and really helpful, like the GDP, not just in the country, but also outside the country as well. And the trade between countries was quite readily available because you had independent sources for that information over a long time period. But investment as a variable was quite hard to define and quite hard to find really good information on, actually. So we're still looking out for new sources on that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, so looking at our data sources here, we try to focus mostly on two aspects of our data sources. First, data that was freely available, so that we didn't have to keep paying a subscription, for example, to for continued access of that data. And then the second part, of course, we want data from reputable institutions. We're not going to get data from um, random websites that claims to have information on a specific variable or a specific sector. So we focused on data sources such as World Bank, um, the World Trade Organization, the IMF itself. So the international institutions that we know are going to have reliable data. Also national institutions, so the statistical centers of Abu Dhabi, statistical center of the UAE. Um, we collected some data as well from Statista, Bloomberg, which are paid sources, but mostly we try to, because Statista and Bloomberg, of course, sometimes they have better access to some sorts of data, and sometimes they're just transforming or reusing data from let's say primary sources, which would be the government sources, the official government sources. So of course, when that was the case, we tended to use the government sources, which again are freely available, and sometimes they were even more better to use in the sense of we get the raw information in there, and then we can do the transformations that we want to understand the data better instead of having to use the data that has already been transformed by a third party. We have also used data sources from for example, the IEA, which is the International Energy Agency. So these international agencies as well that are not directly connected to, let's say, the UN or to a big um, inter-country organization, but are still very reputable and very trustworthy in terms of data sources.
Yeah, and we don't mention all the data sources on the slide. I don't think. I think we've loads of other ones as well, but it's
Yeah.
worth it's worth saying that what we were trying to do, Rodrigo, was get all the sources out there, all the public sources, and try and bring them all together in one place. So this took actually months of work actually to get everything that's out there onto into one place. Um, and we have a dashboard actually planned for publication as well, which will help other researchers. We've got some APIs planned as well that'll help share all of this. And because it's all public source generally, then it's absolutely open to everyone. It just takes a lot of effort to either find it, get it, harmonize it, and
Mhm.
share it. But we think we've done a lot of that work. But it's probably fair to say that some of these sources have had some challenges, Rodrigo, compared to other ones.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Aside from factors as such as, for example, website organization, naturally, some places you can find the data in the website more easier than in other places. There's also the fact that some data sources, especially the ones from within the UAE, they are geo blocked, which means that you can only access if you're inside the UAE. So that's also why it would be good. It would be beneficial, let's say, for other people to have access through our dashboards to this data that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access.
Yeah. And we were able to cross-reference between sources. If they had the same information on GDP or inflation, we were able to check that they were actually giving us the same number. So we were able to do some cross verification like that, which was comforting. And most of the time, but not all the time, we've got the consistent information from different sources.
Yeah.
So yeah, on the next slide, then we just sort of summarize the different models that we tried, the machine learning models, statistical models, econometric models. Um, we followed the literature again on which models should work or could work with the relevant variables to make it easier, to make it faster, and to follow some good precedent and how other people do this type of work. Um, and so you'll notice here that we've got an error term, an error in terms of the accuracy. So the higher error means less accuracy in our forecasts. And so you'll notice here that we started off with some quite large errors in the beginning, but then we actually, every iteration, we got more and more accurate generally as we went through different types of model. So this was an interesting dynamic in terms of data analysis generally, in terms of you have to just keep trying different data sources, different variables, different transformations, different model techniques to see if actually you're getting good results. So there was a good deal of trial and error in this case and in this project so far, but we think where we've ended up is really pleasing. And so we wanted to share that with people and just say, listen, we've got to a really good place here. And I'll not go into any of the techniques today, but we will in future series dive into a few of these in particular and explain them in more detail in terms of what they mean, in terms of what was involved in that. But for now, on this slide, we just focus on the evolution and the improvements over time that we found in the different techniques.
Mm-hmm. How long would you say it took us around in terms of months from the first model to the last model in this page here?
This was probably 3 months actually
Mm-hmm.
between, say the cat boost first attempt or two, and the macro model then at the very end, which had the most accuracy. And so 2 or 3 months work, bearing in mind also that we were collecting data as we went as well. So the cat boost didn't have as much data. We were trying it to target different parts of GDP to begin with, different sectors of GDP as well as total GDP. And so it's maybe not a perfectly fair comparison over time because everything was changing as we went, including the available information. But yeah, 2 or 3 months work involved to try and get to this sort of a degree
Mm-hmm.
of accuracy and iteration.
Yeah, we're also doing multiple trials at the same time, right? So we had more than one people working in this modeling and trying different models simultaneously.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
and we're still trying different ones, aren't we? We're still principal component analysis, for example. Some things that we didn't try during this particular period, we're still working on those at the minute. And you could say as well, if we went right back to the beginning with all the data that we have now, we might get some different results with some of those previous techniques. And obviously, some of these
mhm.
techniques depend on, well, what was the transformation, what was the pre-processing techniques and the backfilling techniques that were used before trying the model. So this just happened to be what we got at the time. But yeah, very much there's plenty of scope for redoing something like this. But I would say it does tell us a lot about data analysis and the forecasting project and what's probably involved for any type of project like this is quite a lot of iteration, quite a lot of feedback loop and iteration.
Yeah, yeah. So taking a look at these models that we saw in the past slides, that we divided them, of course, the ARIMA models or seasonal ARIMA included in that macro model and the machine learning models. So the earlier ones that we have performed, and of course, we're never going to find a perfect model for GDP. Uh, by definition, a model is a simplification, so we're always going to have upsides and downsides. Um, in terms of the REMA model and the macro model, they both had the big upside of first of all being simple, not only simple to estimate, but also simple to explain to other people and to show what exactly was going on in terms of our estimation. They were also accurate. We had low error. Also, the error here we're measuring as mean absolute error for those that are a bit more familiar with the terms. So that's that. that was our main metric in terms of accuracy. So that's the biggest advantage of both the models. In terms of the ARIMA model, we had a big advantage as well in terms of updating it, since the ARIMA model only involves, or at least our model only involved one variable, which was GDP. It's very easy to update every time we get a new GDP data point, every time we get a new observation, they publish a new GDP results and new national accounts data. We can update the model very easily, very readily. So the same day that the data is out, we can already have an updated model. So that's a big advantage as well. However, in terms of disadvantage, it doesn't allow for scenario testing. So if we want to understand, or if we want to try to forecast what may happen to GDP if, let's say, we have a period of higher inflation than we're expecting, the ARU model is not going to allow us to do that. Since we're only working with GDP, we can only respond to GDP data. So that was a big drawback from the ARIMA model. Um, the macro model, on the other hand, it does allow for the scenario testing, because the macro here comes from macroeconomics. So we are using macroeconomic theory to estimate our GDP model. So we're using data such as um, gross capital formation. We're using data such as investments, unemployment, inflation. So when we're building a model like this, we can tweak the data a little bit, or at least tweak the forecasts of our explanatory variables, so that we can draw some scenarios. Because of course, when we're doing forecasting with a macroeconomic model, first we need to create assumptions on how our explanatory variables are going to perform in the future. So we're going to say, for example, oh, we assume that inflation is going to keep at the same rate as it is right now, or um, we have good reason to believe that inflation is going to go up or is going to go down in the next 5 years. So then we use that assumption to calculate what inflation will be, and then we use that calculation to infer our forecasted GDP. Essentially, at very high level, that's how it works. So that's how it allows for scenario testing. We can say, okay, but what if we think that inflation is going to keep at the same level, but what if there is another crisis? There's another gas crisis, or another war that goes on, another pandemic or something like that, and our inflation ends up being higher or lower than we expect. Well, now we can put that into our assumption, into our calculation of the inflation for the next 5 years, and then we're going to have the GDP forecasted with this new assumption. So that is a big advantage of our macroeconomic model. On the downside, however, because we're using many more variables, it becomes more difficult to update, because now you are dependent on not only the GDP data being available, or the newest GDP data being available, but you also have to be dependent of these other data points, which are sometimes um, published by different sources. And sometimes these other sources may take longer to publish, or they take a little, might be less reliable, let's say, in terms of their frequency of reporting. And so this can make it more difficult to keep the model up to date. So sometimes you may have a situation where, for example, our model will only be able to estimate the model up to 2021, and then we'll have to, if we want to forecast GDP for 2024, we're going to actually have to forecast 22 and 23 first. So that, of course, will reduce a little bit our accuracy for 2024, compared to if we have complete data up to date until 2023. So that ends up being a little bit of a disadvantage in our macro model as well. And then lastly, we had the machine learning models, which again were the first models that we tried. They also have this advantage of allowing for scenario testing, because we're using many variables. On the other hand, that also comes with the downside of being more difficult to update. And so that ends up being the paradigm that we face also with machine learning models. On the downside part as well, when we're talking about machine learning, it becomes much more complex to explain what the model is doing, especially if we're talking to people or trying to explain it to people that don't have the background in data science, which are most of us. So it becomes much more difficult to explain what this model is doing. In some cases, we even have the problem which we call the black box model, which are models that we simply can't really see what it's doing inside there. We only see the input and the output. So that's a big drawback as well for at least for our intent in forecasting GDP for the machine learning models. And as we saw in the previous slide, they were a bit less accurate, although, as PJ put it, um, since we at first didn't have like access to all the data that we had at the end, this loss of accuracy or this lower accuracy might not be as much of a problem if we work with the complete data set. However, although we did try, we kept reusing these previous models whenever we got new data, and still they didn't reach the same accuracy as we did with the ARIMA and the macro model.
Yep. And one of the things we haven't mentioned is that how far in advance we were trying to forecast, and a lot of GDP forecasts can be just quarterly in advance, maybe up to a year. But we tried a more difficult 5 years ahead initially. But all of the techniques and all the data and all the information that we're discussing today, we can easily do quarterly and have tried some quarterly forecasts as well. But we also mentioned on the slide that we might update Rodrigo periodically.
Mm-hmm.
But how often do you think that might be on our side?
So ideally, we'll be able to update at least on our ARIMA model. We want to update in quarterly. So every time we have new GDP data available, we are going to update our model, run it again, and not only see how it performed for the previous quarter, but also what it's forecasting now for future quarters and how it has changed or not in terms of forecasting with the previous specification or the previous data set that we had. So that's something to look out for. In terms of our macro model, it might be more feasible to do it annually since some of the data that we used for the model are only available annually, not quarterly, unfortunately. So that's also something that we may be able to do. And of course, we're always looking for new ways to estimate. We're always keeping an eye out for in the literature, trying other modeling techniques that we still haven't tried. So as for example, as PJ put, the PCA analysis, PCA models are something that we're currently working on. In terms of machine learning, there are many other techniques out there that we still haven't tried. So that's also something that we're keeping on a pipeline. Um, so yeah, those are only a few examples of work that are still ongoing and we can expect to do in the future.
Yeah, very good, excellent. And then we've just a few more slides left. I know we're coming to the end of 30 minutes. But yeah, today is the first of just sort of covering our framework and the first of at least three of these events during September. So keep an eye out for next week and the following week, where we plan to dive into two of the models in particular that give us really good accuracy, the ARIMA model and the macro model. And when we mention the accuracy standpoint, we're comparing to the other forecasts that are out there for UAE GDP, which is the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the UAE Central Bank. So those are our benchmarks for how we're doing, what the GDP will be according to those other two sources, and what we think it'll be according to our own analysis. So we'll dive into the next day the ARIMA model, and next Thursday we'll tell you more about what that means, how we did it. There's loads of different ways of doing ARIMA, and so we'll cover some of that in detail. In the following week, we'll dive into the micro model in detail as well, and we'll tell you more about how we did that. and exactly what we mean by macro model, because that is a term that we've created to brand the multivariable equation that we've used there in that macro model. It comes from macroeconomics that Rodrigo mentioned. But yeah, also in terms of recapping as well, you might want to have a look at our Eventbrite page, where we have some courses on GDP that cover the basic knowledge and requirements about what it actually is, what it actually means, how it's actually calculated, where the information comes from, what it tells you about the economy, and what it doesn't tell you about the economy. So feel free to check those.
Yeah, and also on Eventbrite, we also have a course on our this work that we've done on forecasting GDP. So we delve there into much more detail on what we have done, what our results were. So if you want to learn more about it, the methods and everything, feel free to check it out. We have not the GDP series that PJ mentioned, but also an econometric series in which you can understand a little bit better models such as the ARIMA and the macro model that we will talk about in the following weeks. We also explain them in much more detail, in a little bit even more, let's say, lesson-based content. So feel free to check it out and get to learn a little bit more about all this, all these techniques and all of this experience that we've had working with GDP.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you. Feel free to
Thanks for joining.
yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks,
Thank
Rodrigo.
you. Bye bye.